Detainees held in custody, some for years not convicted of a crime, all because they can't pay for freedom. Bail reform was meant to create equality in the criminal legal system. More than 2 years later, the legislation, a lightning rod for debate, as critics say it's causing a rise in violent crime.
Criminals have more rights in New York State than victims. It's got to end. The madness has to stop.
We look at the data and talk to stakeholders to get a better understanding about what's really going on. The CBS News New York Special, a conversation on bail reform, begins right now.
I'm Aundrea Cline-Thomas, and welcome to a conversation on bail reform. It's one of the most polarizing topics in Albany. It even has Governor Hochul negotiating a compromise to implement changes to the law. Let's take a look at how all of this started. As violent crime continues to rise in the city, law enforcement to lawmakers are taking aim at bail reform. Mayor Adams is among the staunchest critics.
2019 to 21, number arrested for homicide out on bail for gun offenses tripled. We're talking homicides. We lost lives.
Historically, bail was established only as an incentive for defendants to return to court. Marie Jai is an attorney with the Legal Aid Society.
Bail is not meant to be punishment. It is not a system of punishment. And under our Constitution, if you are arrested, you are innocent until proven guilty.
But bail resulted in the mass incarceration, mainly of people of color. In 2019, while Black New Yorkers made up 24% of the city's general population, they were 50% of people charged in criminal court and 56% sent to jail pre-trial. Bronx District Attorney Darcel Clark remembers her early years as a prosecutor in the 80s.
The answer was law enforcement, just sweep up everybody, the whole community, everybody. And I was a prosecutor then, and our job was they brought them in, it was nail them and jail them. That's how we thought we kept the community safe. We know now better than that.
In 2015, Khalif Browder became the face of the impact of that approach. Browder took his own life following his release from Rikers Island after spending years behind bars, unable to post bail on low-level charges that never went to trial. In fact, most defendants are unable to post bail, resulting in jail time.
Incarceration of a couple of days, which most people assume is no big deal, can really be catastrophic to housing insecurity, food insecurity, job insecurity.
The jail population sharply declined from nearly 22,000 in 1991 to just over 7,000 in 2019, when crime reached record lows, despite fewer people being behind bars. A vast majority were being held pre-trial on a variety of offenses. The bail reform law, first implemented in January of 2020, then rolled back under intense pressure that July, sought to address the disparities by eliminating cash bail for nearly all misdemeanors and nonviolent felonies, meaning those without money could remain free while awaiting trial. When bail is set, judges also have to consider a defendant's means, not create a financial hardship, and provide easier options to pay.
They have a better chance of seeing their case through without having to take a coercive plea, a better opportunity to not face any jail or prison time at all, and a better opportunity to not face a conviction at all.
As bail reform was being implemented, the COVID pandemic was also raging. Arrests plummeted. Courts became backed up as virtual proceedings went into effect. And by the summer of 2020, gun violence was also on the rise.
Judges began setting bail more often when they had that discretion on cases where they had been releasing people.
Researcher Michael Rempel studies the impact of the law.
The evidence to date doesn't suggest that it was bail reform that led to the uptick in gun violence.
While not being able to detain people on certain charges, in select cases, judges can use electronic monitoring, required treatment, and other programs while defendants await trial as part of an expanded supervised release.
People are released on supervised release. That's a joke. The city hasn't well financed that.
According to city data, of the tens of thousands of people awaiting trial from January 2020 to June of 2021, 5% or less were rearrested in any given month, mostly on misdemeanors. That translates to about 2,000 people each month.
Are they reoffending in a different
percentage than before the bail reform laws were put in place?
Yeah, there's no indication of that whatsoever.
New York is the only state that does not allow judges to consider public safety when setting bail or pretrial detention, a major factor critics of the law want to change.
There's a small percentage that is causing the violence and the harm in our community. They're taking advantage of the bail reform that was put in place to provide that equity for everybody.
The statistics mean nothing to the victims in traumatized communities. The Bronx District Attorney's Office investigated 600 shootings last year alone, but Clark does not blame bail reform laws.
I can't prosecute my way out of here, but we can do a lot of prevention to keep people from coming in the first place. We have to look at the root causes of crime. And it's not necessarily a law, it's what's happening in our community. We have people that live at the poverty level or below. They don't have jobs. The schools are not preparing our kids the way they should. People are homeless.
Providing more resources, Clark says, should be a larger focus of the strategy, not an excuse.
It's about time that we get the resources that we need in the Bronx.
All while keeping jail and state prison for the most violent on the table. Now we want to continue the conversation with a panel discussion. Joining us are Ben Tucker. On December 31st, Ben Tucker retired as the NYPD's first deputy commissioner. His career with the department began in 1969, and he worked his way up, serving in the second highest ranking departmental position when he left. Also here today is retired Judge Jeffrey Cohen. He's served nearly 30 years on the bench, including in the appellate division of the 2nd Judicial Department, the state Supreme Court, and as a Westchester County Court judge. He currently practices law with the firm Abrams Fensterman LLP. And Brooklyn Assemblywoman Latrice Walker joins us virtually as she's hard at work in Albany, a licensed attorney who was elected in 2014. She sponsored the original bail reform legislation and continues to advocate to keep the current law intact. Thank you all so much for being here for this really important discussion. Now, as you all know, bail reform passed in 2019 in the legislature after Democrats gained the supermajority. And now Governor Hochul is talking about negotiating changes to the law. Assemblywoman Walker, we're going to start with you. You are currently on a hunger strike right now to keep this law intact. Have you talked to the governor about the changes that she's really trying to make?
So we have had an opportunity to speak with the lieutenant governor, but no, I have not spoken with Governor Kathy Hochul.
What have your conversations been like?
So the conversation has been about pushing back the dangerousness standard. There are different conversations that folk are having, which we should consider seriousness. We know that the OCA issued a report recently that detailed that there are biases within our judicial system. And I think to add and lend a dangerousness standard to our bail consideration, since we know that bail should not be punitive, shouldn't be cruel or unusual punishment. There's no due process in that process. A person has only been charged. And so we want to ensure that the tenets of New York state law, which ensures that bail is only about securing a person's return to court, continues to be a major tenet of New York state law.
So, Judge Cohen, let's bring you in on this about the seriousness. And for people to understand, that's really giving the judge an authority to predict who will reoffend while out and try to keep them in. So you say that judges need that discretion.
I believe we need more discretion. When I say we, I still think of myself as a judge. I'm not a judge any longer.
You just retired.
Otherwise I wouldn't be. I retired about a year ago after 30 years, as you know. Yes, I agree that there are judges with biases. There are implicit, there are explicit biases. All of us human beings have biases, and we need to address that. That as judges particularly, and certainly as law enforcement, all of us have that. You know, those are the things that are taught to us. We're not born with it. I think it is imperative that judges who are closest to the defendants, who are elected to set bail, should be elected to set bail in certain circumstances, certainly not excessive bail. But what disturbed me and most of us, and I'm sure the Assemblywoman would agree with me, was judges would set low bail, what we would consider low bail, $100, $200, for fare jumping or for some misdemeanor, and it could have been $1 million. It didn't make any difference, and as we know, Rikers Island was loaded with pretrial defendants or principals, which was a horror.
The CJA does a survey of most people who are arrested, and the questions that they ask are, where do you live? How long have you lived there? Where do you work? How long have you worked there? How many years of education have you received? Those questions don't go towards a person's propensity towards dangerousness. Instead, it talks about the poverty that that individual experiences. And the higher you score on this particular survey, CJA will either recommend you for ROR, that's release on your own recognizance, or remand. And so a lot of the discretion that judges have been using actually were based on these very biased algorithms that have been placed and have been determined to be discriminatory in nature against Black and brown youth who come before the judicial system.
I can't disagree with you, and I believe that algorithm, and I believe there need to be changes, and I believe that's part of what we should be talking about.
So what should dangerousness look like then? What are the guidelines?
How many prior, certainly prior crimes, how strong the case may be, were there 3 witnesses, were there, I mean, those are, there are many factors that go into that. Not the zip code, not the color of his or her skin, that is the last thing that should be considered, and it is offensive to me that was the case, and that when we talk about dangerousness, 49 out of 50 states in these United States consider dangerousness in releasing a defendant, and it should not be a factor in a misdemeanor case if it's this person's first misdemeanor. One of the things that I'm very concerned about is what I would call predicate misdemeanors. A person gets out under the new law on a misdemeanor, and the next day commits another misdemeanor and must be released again and again. We all know about this person who recently, it's been in the news, spreading feces on someone. He had a rap sheet of 40 prior crimes, and he had to be released. I'm not suggesting that bail reform is the cause of increased crime, but we could do better, although it was an amazing first and second step. And I think some more should be done.
And so,
I don't believe that that the perception about the desk appearance tickets are as black and white as the judge makes it seem. So in the event that someone receives a desk appearance ticket, the law allows them to be able to be brought before a judge within 20 days. It is my contention that the court can actually set a shortened time period, so perhaps they can come before the judge the next day. In addition to that, the police have 2 different options that they can utilize. Number one, if they believe that this person poses a threat to someone and they believe that an order of protection should be issued, then they can put that person and have him booked and arraigned before a court in order to make that determination. And there were also a number of other crimes that were put into the bucket that did not allow each and every misdemeanor to come back again. In addition to that, if a person received bail reform one time, on the second time that they come before the court, if there is an identifiable harm to an identifiable person or property, then that second offense becomes bail eligible so that there is no second bite at the apple. In addition to that, if the court decides that there was a mental health situation that has been taking place here, as in the feces incident, which I think was horrible and disgusting, a court could have put that person in a mental health situation. What happened in that case was that it started out in the Bronx, but by the time that person got to Brooklyn, a Brooklyn judge looked at him and said, something isn't right here. And they put the mental health hold on him. And we believe that all of the judges who came in, who encountered this individual, could have exercised that same discretion and authority that bail reform provides. But now they're able to give them the services that they need because of the non-monetary conditions that bail reform allowed for them to be able to utilize.
I'm going to go ahead and put a pin in that because I want to talk to Commissioner Tucker, because recidivism is the main issue that law enforcement has had with this, and they term it catch and release.
Yeah.
You know, so where do you stand on this issue? These
laws needed to be reformed. They needed to be changed. And you know, they were having a disparate impact, certainly on people of color, and I saw it, you know, throughout my career. Cash bail, if it were up to me, I'd eliminate it altogether. That would be my preference, but I do think it's persuasive to think about how you, how giving judges the ability to exercise their discretion when Ben Tucker, who has been before them, been arrested, been charged with a possession of a weapon, charged with assault, charged with other crimes, and time again. They haven't been remanded. They're back in the streets, and certainly under the new statute, that is pretty much the formula that we see. And so it is a challenge. There are people out there who are dangerous. They are a danger to themselves in some cases. It's very complicated because you can't ignore the mental illness issues that we are all seeing now and have seen under a very bright light over the past couple of years, in particular, because there's really no help. We have, in my view, basically abandoned people who have mental illness and have not been able to really give them the services that they need. The individuals who are arrested time and time again, the judges should have the opportunity and the ability to say Ben Tucker is being remanded for this reason, pre-trial, and we have the data that, you know, when you look at the data I think supports this notion. Law enforcement has been one of the loudest critics when it comes to bail reform, and so how does that affect policing on the ground if they feel like if I pick somebody up for this offense and they're going to be back out because it's not bail eligible? How does that affect what crimes police officers pursue? Well, it sends a message that somehow that we're not taking this seriously. So, and it affects morale. It's a real factor. Officers won't stop doing their job, but they do, I'm sure, when it comes to getting up and going to work every day and you happen across individuals who commit crimes, but you know when you issue when you make the arrest or under the new law, you're depending on the nature of their conduct. If it's a misdemeanor or an felony, you're going to have to, or you're required to issue a desk appearance ticket in every instance, and so there's really no discretion in that regard, and so that's a problem. The crime numbers have gone up dramatically, and this happened, you know, before the new reform laws went into effect in 2019. We started to see an uptick in January and February of 2020 that suggested to us at that moment that we have a problem with respect to recidivism, right? People are in and they're out, they're in and they're out, and they're in and they're out.
Last weekend, there were 29 shootings, many of which probably were in the Assemblywoman's, some of which were in the Assemblywoman's district. I know a lot of those shootings were in Brooklyn. 29 is a huge number, obviously. I'm not attributing it to the Bail Reform Act at all.
Right, because they're bail eligible.
Yes, no. Criminal possession, if I may, criminal possession of a weapon in the third degree is not bail eligible. Criminal possession of a weapon in the third degree should be bail eligible. That's owning a gun, having a gun, and that's not bail eligible. A judge has to release that person, ROR, and maybe add some tools to the toolbox, as I I've heard said before, but those tools were always available. Not all guns and gun possession can a judge set bail on, and that's one of the things that can be tweaked.
So my brother was murdered at the age of 19, and so no one wants guns to be off the street no more than I do. Yes, I know the district that I represent, and people want to be safe, but we don't have to compromise our civil rights in order to maintain that safety. We have been having conversations with respect to guns in our community. The fact of the matter remains is that shootings remain bail eligible. And for possession of a gun as a misdemeanor, the likelihood that someone is charged with that as their only and top charge in New York City is slim to none. And the conversation can be had to take firearms out of misdemeanor weapons possession. You don't get an argument from me here. Now, we're talking here about bail reform. Bail. And so if a person commits a shooting, whether we're talking about 2016 or 2022, if a person pays bail, they're still out to defend in their case. And so I'm confused as to what the outcome is here that people are looking for. And that's locking up the poor and ensuring that they have to live within the inhumane conditions of Rikers Island. Because if I have money to post bail, whether or not I carry one gun or 20 guns, as long as I pay bail, I would still be released the next day. This is an assault on the poor. And this is the conversation that we're talking about here. Misdemeanors and low-level felonies. Everything else is bail eligible.
I don't disagree with you about the fact that a person what you are agreeing with me about is that a judge should have the discretion in violent crimes to set bail. Of course, if a person can make bail, they're out. There's nothing else you can do. The purpose of bail is to avoid pre-trial detention. You are guilty only once you're found guilty beyond a reasonable doubt. What is compounding our problem is COVID, closing the courts, the delay in prosecuting, the delay in getting your trial. This is going on for years and years. You and I don't have a dispute about any of that. All I'm suggesting is that there are certain types of crimes that could be added to the list that are, one of which is one group of which are repeat misdemeanors, which needs to be addressed, where a judge can only ROR. I know there was a change where a person who was charged with misdemeanor and then a felony, that person could be put in on bail, but we have misdemeanor predicate offenders that are committing misdemeanors. And there's a new crime that's come out over the course of the last several months where a group of people run into fancy schmancy stores and they steal a couple of $100,000 worth of stuff. Well, that's not a violent crime, and bail can't be set. And something should be done about that, too.
There's a nexus here that is inextricably in place where today it's a misdemeanor, tomorrow it's a felony, right? And in fact, with respect to e-felonies, those are not bail eligible. We're seeing shooting after shooting after shooting, violent offenders. I'm talking people who, they're very violent people, and they've been arrested for guns in the past, CPW, and now, and the truth is, Ben Tucker is the shooter today, and tomorrow Ben Tucker is the victim.
Yeah.
You know, and so, and I've noticed before I left the department in this last couple of years, when we all watch crime shoot up, after having been the lowest it's ever been since the 50s, you know, the city was safe and people felt safe. Those conditions have changed dramatically, come 180 degrees in a different direction. We see it, the police see it every single day. And so we have to think about that and take that into consideration when it comes to, and that small number of people are the people who, if they come before me and I'm the judge, Ben Tucker's not going, he's remanded. And it's a hardline remand until trial.
I agree with you, Mr. Tucker. And as a judge, whenever someone has a loaded gun or they committed a shooting, you have the ability to do a number of things with respect to bail, up to and including remand, also including electronic monitoring, or offering some of the non-monetary conditions that are presented before you. I just want to be clear here that the conversations, I want to make sure that we're comparing apples to apples.
Okay.
And if we're talking about shooters, then we're talking about the fact that bail is still eligible in that case. And so the culprit here is not bail reform. There may be some nexus with respect to crime and violence, but don't point to bail reform as being the culprit here, because it is not.
There is a lot of consensus here in terms of like where we're starting. And I really want to show folks how we got here years ago. Right? And with these changes, the concern is that it's going to put more people behind bars in New York City. All of this is happening. We have to talk about Rikers Island as death mounts on Rikers Island. 16 detainees died last year alone. 3 so far this year. So we spoke to Marvin Mayfield, who is now a criminal justice advocate, but decades before bail reform was in place, he spent years of his life on different occasions on Rikers Island awaiting trial. He shares the long-lasting impact.
I came up in a time, in an environment where most young black men were expected to become part of the criminal justice system at some point in time. And I fell into that category, into that trap. I mean, at age 15, it was the first time I had some interactions with the police. Fast forward, I'm 22 years old. I'm just coming home from the military, right? I'm still living in Brooklyn. I got a little apartment in Brooklyn. It's 2 a.m. I'm walking down the street coming from a party, and the police approach me, throw me on the hood of the car, rough me up, beat me up, hit me in the ribs with their sticks. And it wasn't until I got to Central Booking that I found out that I was being charged with a crime that had occurred in the neighborhood, right? And I was being charged with a burglary. So even though they took me in under suspicion because I was in the place, they held me because of my record, because I've had a prior charge. 3 days in Central Booking before I got to a judge who imposed a $10,000 bail on me. I didn't have $10 at the time.
So they took you to Rikers?
So they took me to Rikers. And that's when the story really begins. It was hell. 11 months of abuse, 11 months of degrading treatment, 11 months of negligence and apathy and brutality. So at the end of 11 months, on one particular court date, the prosecution comes to me and says, Mr. Mayfield, and I should mention that not at any time had my lawyer or anyone ever said, here's the evidence we have against you, here's the discovery, nothing. After 11 months, they said that if you plead guilty today, you get time served and go home.
So your option was to stay in and fight this case, or you can go home today.
I can go home today, but another guilty plea to a felony on my record. The worst and hardest blow of everything was to plead guilty to something I didn't do just to stop that suffering. And and the prosecutors held all the cards, and they told me that if I didn't take this plea today, they're going to dangle this mandatory minimum over my head of 5 years. So instead of rolling the dice, right? Instead of taking my chances, I pled guilty and I went home that day. But I went home as a 2-time felon.
Tell me what you're feeling right now.
I feel set up, set up by a system that didn't have to incarcerate me at that time. They didn't have to do that,
Before you went in, you had started a job, you had secured in a place, had a car.
Right.
What happened to all of that?
All of those things, my job, my car, and my place, were all gone after 11 months. I couldn't hold on to it.
For 2 decades, Marvin Mayfield became part of the revolving door of the legal system and was incarcerated pre-trial multiple times, including on drug charges, before he says he took another plea deal and served time in prison. This was before the bail laws were changed. Now Mayfield is a community organizer and advocate for criminal justice reform.
I have to raise my hand. I haven't always been the upstanding citizen that you see sitting here today. I raised my hand to some things that I've done in my life, but these were things that happened in my neighborhood, in my community.
You never went to trial. You were held every time because you couldn't pay bail.
Right.
What did that experience do to you?
It made me feel helpless. It made me feel trapped.
Do you think the legal system would have expected you to turn out the way you have?
The legal system would never have expected me to turn out the way I have. You know what? I didn't even expect me to turn out the way I have.
If there's one thing in this whole bail reform conversation that you want to make sure you convey to people, what would that be?
That bail reform is working. And it has been able to save lives, transform lives. And I guess bring fairness to a system that had been completely against people of color.
So Marvin's story is something that we hear often, especially, too often. And Judge Cohen, I know you said you wanted to respond to that.
It is outrageous that a person such as Mr. Mayfield and others, the young man who died who committed suicide,
Khalif Browder.
Yeah, the person who committed suicide, who was in jail for a couple of years, waiting for his trial, who never got his trial, but they released him because he was probably in jail longer than a misdemeanor, which is a year, and he ended up killing himself. It is outrageous, and I am so opposed to pretrial detention, and I know it impacts people of color, and I know that it impacts brown and black people much more than it impacts white people. And as I said, I was a legal aid attorney, and I'm not putting myself in your shoes. I can't. But I am concerned not that the Bail Reform Act is creating this problem with shooters. I am not suggesting that. I know that. I'm suggesting that there are other laws and that there are other circumstances where judges lost their discretion and should be given back their discretion. That's all that is the point that I'm trying to make.
I want to talk about Mr. Mayfield. You know, I asked him, how did he turn his life around? And he said that it was because he got services. NYU and Columbia had a program, and because he was an offender, that he was able to get into that program, and that really, and he was ready for it as well when he got it, right? So, and that created that shift. But I want to talk about supervised release because that's a tool in judges' toolboxes, but it's been classified as a joke. That's what two different people have told me that, who are on opposing sides of this, actually, this argument. Is that an area where changes could be made? Assemblywoman Walker, is that something that you would consider?
We do appreciate that the governor, in her proposed budget, as well as in her 10-point proposal, she's indicated more resources for those particular services. We've also matched those in our Assembly and Senate One House proposals. And it is also our hope and contention that the mayor would also be likewise as forthcoming in providing the resources, again, for those services. We heard District Attorney Darcel Clark indicate that many of those pretrial services that we are attempting to mandate, there's no funding for them. And I think that it is a responsibility of government to provide the tools that are necessary in hopes that all of the tenets of bail reform are available. And in fact, that is why we say that judges have more discretion now, because we put more tools in their toolbox to be able to utilize so that a person does not continue in a life of crime, but that they're getting the services that they need, access to housing and jobs and education that will lend to them being productive citizens in society.
But apparently it's broken right now. And so, you know,
it's terribly broken.
And so, Commissioner Tucker, how difficult is that for law enforcement then?
It very often falls back on law enforcement because these folks are now, there's no supervision. They're out there. They're still engaged in whatever illegal conduct they were engaged in before while they're on supervised release. So our officers see it every day. And so that creates a problem. You know, again, it's a morale issue, but it also it's a deeper problem, which is unless we fix the entire system. I mean, and the Assemblywoman said it. You know, we have to invest in in all of this. I mean, Rikers is a disaster. I remember when Rikers in the 80s, we were at 150% of capacity, and then we were sued, and we rented a barge and parked it on the river, and we were housing. I don't know if you remember this, Jeff.
I do.
And it was insane. And Rikers it's pretty much way down in population now, not only because of COVID, but I think there was a real effort to really think about closing it, that whole debate and discussion. But it is also at the front end, I believe, it's important for us to pay more attention to our youth and in our public school system. You know, are we giving those youth who have the ability, they live in the neighborhoods we're talking about. We talked about Brooklyn, we talked about Brownsville, Bed-Stuy. All over the city, we have kids in schools who are at risk for getting involved in drugs and crime. And these are exactly the same violent neighborhoods. There's shots being fired in the streets almost daily. So this is a serious problem. How do we get better at identifying these youth? You can't fix it in piecemeal. You know, excuse me. You have to. You're talking about the conditions in which these youngsters live. They need to have support. They don't always have the kind of support that they deserve, or because of the family situations. And so there are those kinds of challenges that are part of this, right? One of the ways you keep Rikers empty is by ensuring that these youngsters get the services and the help and the assistance they need. And be engaged in activities that are positive rather than negative, in order for them to really grow and excel. That's way beyond the conversation we're having, but the truth is we're having this conversation because of our lack of effectiveness in those areas.
And one of the key criticisms in the discussion about bail reform is that it focuses on those who have been arrested and not the victims of the crime. So Jennifer Harrison is on a mission to change that. That's why she established Victims' Rights New York, a political action committee. She tells me why changing the law is not enough, all while still having compassion for people like Khalif Browder. And as we mentioned before, he took his own life after spending 3 years pre-trial on Rikers Island, and his case intensified the push for bail reform.
Khalif Browder shouldn't have been sitting in Rikers for 3 years awaiting trial. So what really is going on, and why are we not addressing those issues? We all want the system to be more fair and just for everybody at the end of the day, but I don't think that the resolution to that, or solution, is to issue blanket release mandates, which is basically what bail reform was. Why aren't things being done to streamline the process of trials and get people out of Rikers? We just really need to repeal it and replace it with a properly well-written piece of legislation that includes input from everybody that everybody that's affected by this. New legislation should definitely have some kind of mental health evaluation or avenue to remand emotionally disturbed people into custody so that they could get the services that they provide. If there's going to be any kind of diversion in between arraignment and court dates for substance abuse issues, that can't be voluntary, because we're seeing a lot of attacks happen because of that. Homeless people, we need to make sure that if a homeless person is being arrested, that they're getting the services that they provide. Release supervision is basically just a term at this point. It's kind of a joke.
The recidivism rates aren't higher with bail reform than pre-bail reform, but it doesn't matter if you're a victim of the crime, right? Tell me, how do we center victims here?
You really can't measure in statistics, because we are the statistics. We are the human element behind statistics. What is the magic number that we need? And why is Albany playing Russian roulette with people's lives? That person, that murder victim, is not coming back. The rape victim is never going to forget that she was raped. The arsonists that are released and burn down people's houses, those lives are destroyed forever. So when is enough enough?
So, Commissioner Tucker, where do we go from here?
We're not talking about repealing any of those bills. What we have done is provide suggested changes and tweaks to the bills that have created, we've dealt with one problem, but we've added another burden for prosecutors and for police. If we make some of these adjustments that are not drastic but reasonable, leaves the bills intact. In my view, this is just the beginning of what the conversation that we have to continue. We kind of tinker around the edges on poor housing and poor education and mental illness and others, and that's not enough. And so, we could be having this conversation 10 years from now, and if we don't come together and figure out how to compromise and work together in ways that are real.
Assemblywoman Walker, you know that you're in Albany. This is an election year, and you saw what happened in Nassau County, that there was a red wave. Democrats were unseated. There's a Democratic supermajority, and that's how this law got passed in the first place. Are you concerned that Democrats will cede seats because of this issue?
After Reconstruction, there was another wave. It was called a reign of terror, and that was the Ku Klux Klan over Black communities. After affirmative action, there was another reign. It was called the Rockefeller drug laws. And so we have seen time and time again when there are laws that are changed in order for us to be able to have a modicum of access to the American dream. So I expect there to be another reign of terror from the day that we passed bail reform and passed criminal justice reform. We have been under political attack, but it's time for us to put people over politics.
Judge Cohen, just a quick final thought from you.
Bail reform is an easy mark for those who attribute the increase in crime to bail reform. I do not. I don't think any of us do. Nevertheless, I believe the Bail Reform Act needs to be tweaked. I'm in agreement with Eric Adams as to some of those tweaks, and we need to get guns off the streets, and mental illness needs to be addressed. Extreme mental illness. The one thing we never talked about, one quick thing, hate crimes. The increase in hate crimes is unbelievable. I mean, I've never lived a life in New York like this. Anti-Semitism, anti-Asian, anti-African-American, and Latinx. I mean, it's just extraordinary. And we need to address all of that, hopefully with new methods.
Assemblywoman Walker, I wanted to get some final thoughts from you. You are on a hunger strike right now as the budget is being discussed. A few more days left. Talk to us about, are there any areas that you're willing to concede?
There are conversations that we're willing to have with respect to the funding that's necessary. We know that communities that have the most resources have the fewest amount of incarceration rates. We're just saying that doing the same thing over and over and over again for the past 30 years and expecting it to render a different result is insanity. We have seen what works, and we're not going to be able to incarcerate ourselves out of this problem and out of this situation. And quite frankly, it's just that bail reform is not the culprit. In January of 2022, 96% of the people who were out on bail reform were not rearrested. And as recent as December of 2021, 96% of the people who were out on bail reform were not rearrested. And those are some amazing and awesome statistics. And these people are now at home. They're taking care of their families. families. They're going back to work. I just want to make sure that we don't have a system that will incarcerate Khalif Browder pre-trial because he's poor, and change it to a system that charges and bails and holds him pre-trial because some judge thinks that he's dangerous and call that progress, because it's not. With respect to guns, we want to make sure that all guns are off the street. And so we remain committed to continuing the dialogue in order to address that situation. And so there are points on all of the different plans where we can find a point of agreement. There's no data that supports the changes that whether the mayor or the governor is alluding to at this point in time. And so we just want to wait until there's empirical evidence and data that supports this, so that we're not changing our laws on anecdotal information based on titillating stories that we believe that a different outcome was deserved if the law had been followed to the letter.
This conversation shows bail reform is not only a law, it's about people's lives. And I hope you can see there's a lot of common ground here, and the differences are complex and nuanced. And we'd like to thank Assemblywoman Latrice Walker, Judge Jeffrey Cohen, and former Deputy First Commissioner Ben Tucker for participating in this discussion. I'm Aundrea Cline-Thomas, and thank all of you for watching the CBS News New York special, A Conversation on Bail Reform.